we continue to get reaction from people who were close to the Archbishop, just to share some thoughts and on this very sad day. And we now speak to author of Tutu's biography, Rabble-Rouser for Peace, and also a board member of the Desmond and Leah Tutu Legacy Foundation, John Allen. Mr. Allen, thank you very much indeed for joining us, and welcome to the program.
Thank you, Ndate. Very much indeed, and greetings to your viewers this evening.
A very, very sad day, but I am pretty sure that you and everyone at the foundation must be feeling this quite a lot today.
Yes, indeed. Our chair, Nicholas Keltrom-Natseke, and the CEO, Piyushi Kotecha, and the whole foundation it is sad, but it's also for everybody, and including the Anglican Church, also a celebration of life, a life well lived, 90 years old, and a life of extraordinary compassion, humanity, and achievement. Just incredible. And to see the tributes coming in, you know, from the British Queen to President Obama to President Biden, from the Pope through the Southern African Catholic Bishops' Conference, it really humbles one as a South African. And there's no way in which I ever felt more of a South African belonging in South Africa than in the church with Desmond Tutu, among the people singing the glorious choruses of Christianity in Southern Africa, in Nsikana's great hymn, Tio Soga's great hymn, Imalonji Kantu, the choir, a congregation just carried us away and makes us feel all deeply and solidly and wonderfully South African.
Writing a biography of someone is not an easy task, particularly someone who's lived such a long and full life. Tell us about your journey in putting words to paper about a life of decades of service.
Well, the period of the biography from the mid-1970s on was not difficult to do, in the sense that I was a journalist on the Star in Johannesburg as the religion correspondent, covering Desmond Tutu before he was a bishop and then when he became a bishop. And then I worked with him during the late 80s, the height of the struggle against apartheid, during the early 90s, the violence of the transition. And so for that part of the biography, the building blocks were in place. I was with him in many parts from times when he marched on John Foster Square, as it used to be called in Johannesburg, in protest against the arrest of the Reverend John Thorne. And he and Mama Leah and about 40 other church leaders got arrested outside the Star building. And then two occasions where he had confrontations with government ministers, confrontations with the police, and then, of course, in the tragic years of the transition, when he was called constantly, he and Ndade Chikane and others, Bishop Stanley Mogoba, Bishop Khoza Mgojo, as president of the SA Council of Churches, they were all called out regularly to intervene very soon after massacres, Boipatong, Sebokeng, Table Mountain near Pietermaritzburg. And so the journey there was just one of reliving those years, seeing the extraordinary capacity. But what attracted me to him in the beginning was his fearless courage, He once told me very early on in the late 70s, when he was beginning to become prominent, he said, well, I accept that I could be killed because of the stand that I'm taking, but I have to do it.
But there were attempts on his life, weren't there?
There were indeed. And one of the things I've concluded in the book was, the apartheid death squads didn't hesitate to target clergy persons. Frank Chikane, as General Secretary of the SACC, his clothing was poisoned and he very nearly died. 1989. The General Secretary of the Southern African Catholic Bishops' Conference, Mangaliso Mkatshwa, two of the Northern Transvaal Security Branch Death Squad had him in their sights at Durban Airport and were going to assassinate him, and only did not do so because because people got in the way leaving the airport. And indeed, Archbishop Tutu, his car was once sabotaged. And so what I concluded is that really what saved his life was probably the granting of the Nobel Peace Prize, because he was campaigning for sanctions strongly at the time. And if the government had assassinated him, immediately it would have brought down on their heads the sanctions they were desperately trying to avoid.
Most of us know the public face, and often leaders have to put on a face because they need to be seen to be strong and brave and lead and give hope. What was he like when the door was closed and he was behind closed doors?
He wasn't different in the sense that the Desmond Tutu you saw was the Desmond Tutu you got in whatever the circumstances were. You know, he wasn't charming and engaging to strangers or to people he was meeting and then grumpy with his staff. He wasn't like that at all. His good humor, his passion, his anger actually could be, you know, what it was in public, it was also in private. But actually, he said, you know, people wouldn't believe this about me. He's so valiant and outspoken and sometimes, you know, so radical and confrontational. He said people wouldn't believe this of me, but actually at heart, I'm a sort of reclusive person. I don't really like to do this, you know, to be this public. And that was right. He could sit in complete silence. I remember once we were in Honduras or Nicaragua, and we were flying home for Christmas, and everything had wound down, and there was nothing to discuss on the plane. And probably for a period of maybe 48 hours of traveling together from one part of Central America to New York, and then to Germany, and then waiting for the flight to South Africa, over that period we hardly exchanged a word, and he was completely comfortable within himself. He comfortable with his own skin, just quietly sitting and spending long hours of the day, probably 4 or 5 hours of the day, early in the morning, in the middle of the day, and early in the evening, in silent contemplation and prayer.
Talking about prayer, I mean, he held the highest seat in the Anglican Church in the country. Tell us a little bit about his faith, how important it was to him in his life, and the work that he did when he wore that collar. As
Archbishop Thabo Makgoba said earlier today, his faith and God were his Alpha and Omega, the beginning and the end for him. They were everything to him. You can't understand him without his faith. He wasn't like a secular human rights campaigner. He was a person of deep, deep faith. And also a person brought up in the churches, dedicated student at theological college who believed you had to do everything precisely correctly. So motivated by his faith, but particularly in the fact, you know, he would talk about a mother in Alexandria or in Soweto, or a grandmother who'd seen her child shot in the yard, maybe a teenager, raised a clenched fist at police going by after Soweto 76, and the child would be shot dead. And he would talk about such a person, saying, and white, maybe a domestic worker, and the white people wouldn't know her real name, and they call her Annie, and he would say, you, mama, you are a child of God. When you look upon such a person, you're looking at God. So his faith motivated and imbued his life and his humanity and his treatment of others. And the anger within him, you know, I often think that young people might look at him and say, well, is it so strange for an archbishop of a Christian church to be preaching peace and reconciliation? Well, if you saw him in the 80s, his anger at injustice, to treat a child of God, somebody made in the image of God, he used to say, is not just unjust as it is. It's not just ill treatment as it is. It's blasphemy, because it's like spitting in the face of God to treat people in this country the way apartheid treated black South Africans.
Talk to us a little bit about the family man, because he was a husband and he was a father. Tell us about that man.
His relationship with Mama Leah was just so beautiful, such a beautiful relationship. I remember seeing in the years when, during the struggle, he did not used to use South African Airlines to travel overseas. And at some stage, Lufthansa was offering the best connections to him to where he wanted to go. I remember seeing very upright, stiff German flight attendants in Lufthansa, all agog, when after taking off on a plane, Archbishop Desmond suddenly he got up out of his seat and he was kneeling on the floor in front of Mama Leah, and they were quite alarmed. What was this man doing? And he was taking her shoes off and putting on her airline socks so that she could sit more comfortably in the plane. And equally in her reaction to him, you were driving home late after something, and he would say what in the church they call compline. It's the last prayers you say before you go to bed, and you'd hear this gentle recitation of prayer, and then she might sing "Tu Mamina, Tu Mamina." Of course, I'm a useless singer, but I mean, just to sitting together, comfortable with one another, with her singing choruses in the back of part of Compline. Wonderful, wonderful.
So, what do you think, when he looks back at his life, were the things that he probably was most proud of, that were the joy of his life?
It's hard to it's hard to select. At a very practical, pragmatic level, when he came into church, he said, "I have 3 objectives," and in fact, it illustrated his life. His one objective was to work for the liberation of South Africa, and he worked for the liberation of South Africa. And the second thing he did, he said, is he wanted women ordained as priests in the Anglican Church, and he achieved that 2 years before he stepped down and retired as Archbishop. And then the third thing was a very pragmatic thing for the church. At that stage, the Diocese of Cape Town stretched all the way to the Namibian border in one direction and halfway to George in the other direction. And he said the Diocese of Cape Town needs to be split up into 3 dioceses, or multiplied, as we used to say. And he didn't achieve that, and he was quite sorry. It was very much a churchy thing that he felt he hadn't achieved.
Do you think that he was sometimes ahead of his time? Because some of the things that he defended and spoke about sometimes fell a little out of church doctrine, didn't they?
Yeah, I mean, the best one is that he would say, "I have campaigned against discriminating against a person on the basis of the color of her or his skin. I have campaigned against preventing a person from becoming a priest on the basis of her gender." And he said, the color of your skin and your gender are something over which you as a human being have no control. And I'm opposed to the injustice of discriminating against a person on that basis. And then he would say, your sexuality is something that I do not believe is something you choose. You're born heterosexual or homosexual. And so he campaigned against discrimination against gay, lesbian people, LGBTQI. And of course, he is ahead of his time in the church, certainly in Africa, where most of the churches in Africa aren't at a position. I must emphasize that the Anglican Church's position, held strongly, and particularly strongly in Southern Africa, is that gay and lesbian people are welcome in the church and must be welcomed into the church. They're Christians as anybody else. But he was upset at the fact that the Anglican Church in Africa, including Southern Africa, does not yet ordain gay and lesbian priests, and does not yet bless the marriages, same-sex marriages. And of course, the most celebrated example is that his youngest daughter, Mpho, two of his daughters are priests, Nontombi and Mpho, and his youngest daughter, Mpho, had to actually hand in her license as an Anglican priest in South Africa because the church didn't approve of her marriage to a woman.
There were also things that made him sad. Post-apartheid South Africa, the Rainbow Nation that he helped coin this phrase, he had so many hopes for what South Africa could become. And I guess in the latter part of his life, he must have reflected and was sad a little that some of these things just didn't happen.
Yeah. He did say he did use that exact phrase, and he talks about, yeah, I'm sad, he said, but he didn't enter the area of liberation with any false expectations. There's a wonderful account of his work in the early 70s in the archives of the World Council of Churches in Geneva. He traveled to made 40-something trips, about 45 trips to 20-something, I think 25 African countries as head of a theological fund for the World Council of Churches. So he saw Idi Amin's Uganda. He saw Ghana after a military coup. He saw Nigeria after the Biafran War. He saw the former Rhodesia under Ian Smith. He saw Mozambique under colonial rule. And so he had a good appreciation, but he also saw Kenya being successful in the early years of its independence under Jomo Kenyatta. And so he saw the challenges and the mistakes that were made in different countries after liberation. And he warned early, before democracy came in 1994, he said that there's nothing which stops an oppressed people from becoming an oppressor. Now, that hasn't happened in Southern Africa. It did happen it hasn't happened in South Africa. It has happened in other parts, perhaps Ethiopia under Mengistu. But but he did recognize that that could happen, and that people are human, and that and he was also quite hesitant to judge individuals. That's one of the things he used to say about Mama Winnie Madikizela Mandela. He would say, who in the shoes of in another person's shoes, subject to the incredible pressures and cruelties that she's subject to, would not make mistakes. He would find it very difficult to judge other people.
Mr. John Allen, thank you so much indeed for joining us and sharing these valuable insights and stories about the most beloved Arch. Thank you for your time this evening.
It's been a great privilege to be with you. Thank you so much indeed.
Good night.